Thank you very much. I'm still the tennis player of the intramural basketball team today. Actually, we're going to have a tournament, annual tournament next week, but we're not going to play. We don't have enough players this time from my institute. Anyway, forgive me for maybe having my voice a little low this morning. I'm having a little cold here. What I would like to interact with you on is what do we call the relational terms in international relations studies. But it so happened that people do not have the background, so it'd be kind of a complicated if I want to start at a level which has assumed people's background knowledge of the debate. This debate has been going on for over almost 2 decades. It is about what's the nature of international relations. I think to put it in a nutshell, primarily international relations have been regarded as interaction between autonomous states. States like atoms interacting with one another, calculating their own interest, their level of power, and then they interact in order to either maneuver their relationship for their own benefits. That seems to be the mainstream thinking right from the beginning, as far back as Westphalia Treaty, which created the state system. But historically, when people start tracing this history, the reflection seems to suggest that at so-called Westphalia moment, which created contemporary modern state system, it wasn't a innocent moment. It didn't happen in vacuum. It actually happened as a result of religious war. So Westphalian treaties basically provide princes and kings the rights to determine what kind of religions his subjects were to subscribe. So it happened. It took place in a Christian world. It is it was embedded in the belief in God. But then, of course, institutionally, you have this imagination of dark age controlled by the Catholic Church, and then you have Renaissance, you have religious reformation, and then you have all this development of science. All of this came together with the formation of international system in history. Imagine that state drawing borders, demarcating their territory, and then they can conquest each other and move their territory. This would not be possible. This would not be within the capacity of people's imagination without the scientific revolution, which allow you to move line on space. Right? You're engineering major. Every point in space supposed to be same in characteristics. So it doesn't matter whether this is mountains or river. Every single point you can manipulate on the map. Things can be moved without the scientific revolution, without the geometry, development geometry. Then you wouldn't have this kind of imagination of nation state. So nation state took place in a heavily religiously and culturally laden environment. But then we tend to forget, especially the mainstream literature on international relations, tend to forget this historical moment not being an innocent moment. It carries such a legacy. So people now reflect upon this and say, no, we got it all wrong. States don't interact with one another just as atoms, each contained within its own territory, its own space. Rather, people interact with one another, or states interact with one another upon the certain assumption, cultural assumption, religious assumption shared by them. Once a state encounters an alien state, religiously speaking or culturally speaking, or we talk about civilizational kind of setting, you encounter someone from outside, then all the assumed courtesy or mode of interaction would not apply anymore. So that triggers you the puzzle whether or not you're encountering a normal population. For example, when Europeans arrived in the American continent in the pre-colonial period, there was the puzzle whether or not American Indians were people or animals. If they were peoples, then they would have to be converted. Then you have to conquer it, you have to indoctrinate them religiously. If they're animals, you can just let them go. So you have to decide that kind of a puzzle. And that has been happening all over the world through the colonial context. And then after World War II, and we have our current international system, and it seems all those historical happening disappear in people's study of international relations. Disappear that people simply assume that we are, every state has been converted in one way or another. So they all act like state. But then when you have, for example, EU emerging, and then for so many decades you don't see the similar institution being copied elsewhere. You have perhaps African Union, you have some organization in like ASEAN or in Latin America, or today you have Shanghai organizations, but then none of them operated like the way the EU has operated. That it seems to be a cultural integration, institutional integration. How come that there is no similar development elsewhere in the world? So this becomes a hot subject. Why there's no East Asian organization? Why ASEAN couldn't resolve disputes or any controversial agenda? How come people don't even try to resolve them? People come together, say hello to each other, and say, oh, we should try to resolve this peacefully. Then they go home. They don't really sit down and resolve. There's no such attachment to the rules of international relations. Rules don't seem to apply in other parts of the world. So it becomes the burden of Euro-American states or system or institutions to preach rules of international relations. What international relations are supposed to be, how international relations should be governed, and then trying to convert everybody, trying to synchronize. Probably that's the more fetish word. Try to synchronize every country, their internal institution, and then realizing this could not be done, and then you're finger pointing to some of them being failing states. They're failing state primarily because they are incapable of operationalized rules popping up from interaction between American, European, Western states. So this is the point that the relational term literature begin to reflect. How come the rules of international relations cannot be spread to the other parts of the world? And then they begin to realize that when states were formed, when state emerged several hundred years ago in Europe, they did not emerge in historical vacuum, like we mentioned earlier, that they carry religious belief. So people share the same historical trajectory, and people similarly to adopt, if not exactly the same, but at least somewhat mutually understandable religious beliefs and institutions. And they could, through interaction, gradually develop ways to govern their interaction. So this is in this long haul history, people or states, European states or Western states, have been able to come up with certain things. And if being a good state or being a normal state already assume that each state has the obligation to practice rules that's already shared or agreed upon by other states. And all these rules have civilizational premises. For one example, the human rights is a concept evolving from European history, and it becomes a nature of the state to protect human rights. Then if you go to other parts of the world, similar human rights have not been protected, then you consider them failing state. Or, for example, with the development of capitalism, then you have this very basic notion of intellectual property rights, which have not really taken roots in other parts of the world or outside the Christian world. Then you find people committing piracy, and then you consider them being thieves. But then people like Chinese people, for example, for their own history, that intellectual product can never be considered as property. Everybody share. I remember some of my students taking qualifying exam in the United States being failed, not because they don't know what to write, but rather they did not cite what they write, and so they consider being stealing other people's intelligence. But that's not what they intended to do. What they intended to do is to show their capacity to memorize the right answer. And the right answer, of course, comes from the literature of the great master, and they memorize that, and everything coming together become their own understanding. They put out a paper which include a lot of citation or quoting or wisdom from many different masters and philosophers, but they didn't cite, and then they failed. I think at least 3 of my students in the United States, one in sociology, one in international relations, the other in political science, failing their qualifying examination because they're being accused of plagiarism. But for me, they are demonstrating the best quality of students from their own culture. I mean, this is very different things. Again, this is what we're talking about. Something already being shared among states that later on constitute the way state understands themselves. So being a state in the Western sense is being responsible for governance, international governance. Today we call it global governance. Remember when President Xi Jinping met President Obama, the first time they met after both of them being elected, I think 2013. I remember what they each talked about to each other. I think Obama was talking about climate, internet security, human rights, anti-proliferation. But President Xi was talking about something kind of a new major power relationship. They're talking about 2 different things. Obviously, Obama coming from the urgency to establish rules of international relations. Every normal state coming and joining international relations should practice those rules. And it's very hard to explain this to countries or nations that do not abide by rules but by relationships. So here comes the subjects I would like to talk about. That in the Western literature, there is reflection upon the international system and realizing that international system has never been operating in accordance with this assumption of atoms interacting with one another. They all came in heavily laden with shared understanding of how international relationship should be run. And then there is also a relational term in the Chinese literature coming primarily from Confucianism with the support of Taoism, some of them, and with a very small stream supported by Buddhism. The argument, of course, basically is that state should, I think the major policy contradiction between the Chinese relational term and Western English relational term is how to deal with the so-called failing states. And the Chinese, according to Chinese relational term, there's no such thing as failing state. Each state should be responsible for its own fate. And other country can only help by supporting a particular state, so-called failing state, to become politically, institutionally healthy so that they could handle their own affairs, finding their own solutions. But for a Western relational term, they look at failing state and understand that these failing state would have to be converted, have to be synchronized, so that they would not become a source of problem for the operation of international relations or global governance. So you have to intervene. Both talking about relationality. Now what's the difference between them? That's, I think, the interesting thing. When they talk to each other, they seem to pass each other. They both talk about relationship and relationality, but they don't seem to talk to each other, although they physically they do, but then logically or linguistically, they seem to miss each other, miss the message they each try to get across. I think the Western relational term is about how state being constituted by pre-existing history, civilization, cultural institution, all kinds of geocultural embedding that has constituted state. So when states understand themselves, when states trying to establish their own identities, they automatically reflect upon their relationality, which exists. So there is the slogan, relation before state. According to the mainstream international relation, there's no such thing as relation before state. Relation only takes place after states are formed and start interacting with one another. When states interact with one another, then there is something called relation. But for the relational term people, no, that's not true. Since all the states being heavily constituted, there's such thing. There's something like a field. You can imagine there's a field, and then a lot of things, a lot of force, culturally, religious, taking place, and it's a messy, complicated world. And then you see state form, emerge in this messy field, and they start interacting with one another. So this field is very important for relational term people. When state, in its process of becoming state, inevitably carry in this process with whoever leading the formation of state, all those messy forces. So there's no state without their self-understanding being already constituted by something before states are formed. That's called relation before state, not relation after state. If you look at the current international relations studies, then all those talk about balance of power, balance of interest, balance of threat, they all assume that relation only comes after state start interacting with one another. But from the relational term point of view, no, that's not true. Relationality exists and constitutes state before state was formed. So you cannot have state which understand themselves without somehow reconstruct, practice the relationality which constitute them. So that's called relation before state. Then if you have emerged from different field, we're talking about such a field, let's imagine this is a spatial geocultural field on the European continent. And then if you move fast towards America or to Chinese continent, Chinese mainland, then you find you have a completely different field. So relationality that constitutes state engender different kinds of state, which would make interaction between them particularly difficult because they do not understand each other, like we're talking about intellectual property rights, right? There's no such thing in Chinese intellectual history, but it's a very essential concept that defines capitalism. So you interact with one another, with one group of nations trying to convert others because they somehow gain sufficient capacity and resources to do that. But that's not just about resources and capacity, but also about the belief, the roles they take for themselves. We can use the example of CPA, perhaps, this accountant. You have to pass all kinds of examination, including ethical examination, so to demonstrate you are familiar with the principle of accounting and you're familiar with the ethics. And ethics later on becomes more important than principles of accounting because after every few years, each qualified accountant would have to take the ethical exam again in order to remind you that you are a CPA, you are a certified public accountant. Now, if accountant go to an enterprise and the enterprise say, hey, I need to hide my revenue this year, so that when I reshuffle rebalance our account next year, our investment next year, it wouldn't show that we're losing money. Or the reverse, somebody say, oh no, we are losing money, but we don't want to show to our shareholder that we're losing money, so we want to hide this loss, and could you put this loss to the next year? And for a CPA, that he or she would definitely say no, because this is not right. This is according to principle of accounting, that you should reveal your accounting condition to all the shareholders so that people can have a fair opportunities to make right judgment on their investment. But then the company say, hey, how about I give you $10,000, you do this for me, and you have to think about it, $10,000 in principal accounting. For the relational term people, as a public accountant, as a CPA, would consider ethical principle of being a CPA part of his or her selfhood. So they would renounce the opportunity of getting this very attractive bribe and covering for the company, then covering for the company and benefit themselves privately, and violating the principle of accounting and also ethical principle too. So for normal state, there is a certain way of being a normal state. Then you have to follow that. And that already comes into your mind before the state is emerging. So if capitalism and the state formations come together at the same time, they interact with one another. So all the states involved in this process would assimilate intellectual property rights when they emerge, when they becoming modern state. And this never be the same to states elsewhere. So relationality, meaning that national identities, national self-identities, necessarily constituted by the rules of international relations, principles of international relations, agreed upon among states before state becomes state. This is not something that we today determine. It's not we decide whether or not intellectual property rights should or should not be enforced elsewhere in the world. It's already ingrained. It's like a gene in our self-understanding. It's given. It's never appears to us there is such an option to give up international property. This is what being called relationality in the Western literature. So self-identities, psychological process within the state can only either reproduce or reconstruct this pre-existing relationality. But for the Chinese relational term, this has never been the case. Both Confucianism and Taoism assume all the living things in the world, including maybe plants, animals, are related in certain ways. But in what ways? There's no very specific principles, and there should not be such principles. So every single actors would have to find ways to govern their relationship. And they have to do that. If they don't, they jeopardize their own existence by being isolated from the rest of the world, and then they are in anarchy. Anarchy has been the state of nature for the mainstream international relations people. But for the Western relational term, anarchy is not the state of nature. Anarchy is the imagined state of nature. Anarchy is an intellectual construction that constitute state identities. So states resort to self-help in a legitimate way and understood by each other. Self-help is legitimate. And self-help is legitimate because they share the imagination of anarchy as state of nature. So that's the relational term thinking. You see the difference? For the mainstream international relations, anarchy is the actual structural state of nature. No one can change that. It's not imagined. It's real. So in order to survive, we have to rely on ourselves. We cannot trust anyone else to help us. There's no way people are going to help us. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they're going to get us if we rely on them. So we have to rely on ourselves. That's the mainstream international relations. The Western relation term will tell you, no, that's not. Anarchy has never been a real state of nature. Anarchy is the imagined state of nature. So people coming from the same European philosophical traditions understand the argument of anarchy put forth by Hobbes, and then they use Hobbes as a metaphor of the relationship between them. So it's all this. It's intellectual. It's not the structural, or it's not natural. But for the Chinese relational term, it is not the relationality that constitutes the state before the state becoming state. It is really state have to interact with some kind of a mutually agreed upon roles, relationships. So state must discover or establish relationships between them. Maybe you have to establish a relationship with different states differently. So it's like differently different. That's another term for post-Western international relations. States interact with each other in different modes differently, and each bilateral relationship has to be mutually agreed upon. And there is dynamic, of course, and then you cannot agree upon everything, but then you have to interact in such a way that you can expect other people how other people would react, and you believe other people can expect how you would react. Then you start interacting with one another and trying to find a pattern, establish a pattern so you can accept each other. And you may have to do this to every other state separately. Sometimes you don't, sometimes you do. And of course, for the Western relational term people, they would think that it will be a lot easier if you have one particular system of rules. You have one particular rule that can be shared by everybody. So everybody is being constituted by the same rule. That's kind of a multiple relationality. But that's never been the case outside the Western philosophical tradition. Countries are always trying to interact with one another based upon their specific understanding of each other. So you have to develop specific bilateral patterns in order to get yourself in a smooth operation, so that you don't have to worry about each other. You know what to expect, and you believe that the other side know what to expect from you. So you have all kinds of bilateral relationships. It's like multilateral, bilateral patterns. And this seems to be very complicated, but it is not, because Confucius has decided that for people to avoid anarchy, the better way for them to do is to adopt the metaphor of kingship. They imagine that for Confucius, for Confucius the person and his disciples, of course, that kingship has probably be the best promise or guarantee of relationship. So you don't suspect that your father, your parents, your son are going to get you. No, you don't do that, because people come together to help each other in order to survive. So coming together as a group with a head of the group, perhaps father, or in matrilineal society, perhaps the mother or uncles, you have centers, and then from the center you have hierarchy. So people would come together in ways that every needed roles have someone to play faithfully. So that's relationship we need. And Confucius believed that this kind of a kinship, this relationship evolving from kinship, that enable people to survive all kinds of challenges in the natural world, perhaps can serve as the best metaphor for political institutions. So let's imagine the head of state, or the son of under heaven, is the father of all the population. So you have this metaphor, and the son of heaven would act selflessly. Because he is selflessly, so people under him would be willing to allow him to make decisions for everyone else, because he's selfless. And the best way for the king or for the prince to survive, of course, is to act selflessly. If he didn't act selflessly, then people would get him to overthrow him. So you have this idea of finding right relationship. Of course, if you don't go to Confucius and you try to enlist the wisdom of a legalist tradition, then you would have you have a different answer. You would think, oh, it doesn't help to rely on kingship, because at the end of the day, the son of heaven is not your father. So you have to rely on law. You have to show people what's the punishment if you don't obey law. So all the roles are being detailed specifically by law, and then people can interact correctly. But whichever traditions you rely on, the Chinese relational term believes that relationships has to be practiced, has to be discovered. The relationships don't exist naturally. You have to work on that. But everybody would have to work on that. If you don't work on that, you're not going to survive at all. So it is some kind of a structure compellence, some kind of spontaneous skill of survival to place oneself within a larger self, which in the Chinese relational term literature called greater self. So each self has to consider him or herself being little self, and then look for a greater self that encompasses them, so they could understand their duties in a very specific way, and then they can become a meaningful self because they are able to contribute to the survival of greater self. It's like children contributing to the welfare of their family, and not just their family, but also the name of their ancestors. So you have this sometimes called pressure, sometimes duty, sometimes inspiration, that you would act as if you are not just by yourself. So this is very different from Western international relations. In the Western international relations, it doesn't matter whether you consciously understand your duty or not. You are already constituted by relationality. You are already practicing, reproducing, or reconstructing the norms, principles that constitute your self-understanding before states become states. So it doesn't matter how you think, although it is very important how you continue to practice the rules, right? Because the process is dynamic. Nobody understands the rules exactly the same. So we are all constituted by rules that share among us, but then we always understand the rules somewhat differently, and events taking place, history moves on, there are all kinds of dynamics, so people would practice, understand, and apply rules differently in each different incident at each different occasion, in such a way that you always have to rediscover whether or not our understanding of the rules are common or similar. So it doesn't mean that Western relational term is being static. No, it's being everybody constituted by relationality. Everybody practice relationality. Everybody reconstruct relationality. So it's a dynamic process. On one hand, you're being constituted already. On the other hand, you are creating new rules because of the dynamics of international relations. But you don't have to think about it. It's not you consciously doing that. What you are consciously doing perhaps is just like what the mainstream international relations would have you. According to mainstream international relations, everybody calculates its own interest, and depending on how much power the state owns, and then trying to set up alliance, doing everything for the state itself. So consciously, you don't think about relationality. Consciously, you think about only yourself. But according to the relational term, you are producing or reproducing balance of powers or rules of international relations. So you are reconstitute yourself with rules which you already agreed upon, but then you practice in a somewhat little differently because you are now in a nuclear age, or now you are in an electronic age. So you have different technology that force you into new relationship, develop new rules, but whatever you do, you are being constituted by relationality, defined as field. We talk about this messy things going on behind us. So consciousness is not essential for Western relational term people to analyze international relations. But for the Chinese international term, consciousness is very important. We're all conscious that we are being threatened by the nature of the world. We are being threatened by perhaps someday we'll be reduced to anarchy that will have problem with survival. So we must belong to a larger group. We must establish greater self. We better establish greater self as a whole, but that's very difficult. So we try to establish greater self with every other state. And as an entire system, everybody is involved in all kinds of multilateral, bilateral, greater self. So everybody feel safe. So you wouldn't feel being threatened. Your security is not in being jeopardized simply because you have a problem with particular state, because you know you're being involved in a much complicated relationship. But all these relationships would have to be consciously tried and developed. It's not there by nature. What's there by nature is people's need for relationship. So that's the Chinese relation terms all about. Because people need relationship, so people don't go out to look ways to convert or synchronize other countries simply because they're different. So difference is fine. Difference is no threat. What's threatening us is there's no mutual understood rules that govern our relationship. And this particular rule that govern our relationship should not be simply applied to other bilateral, paralleling bilateral relationship, because we have different conditions with other states. So Chinese relational term attends particularly to bilateral relationships. And it is conscious efforts to do that. So when Chinese relational term people analyze international relations, they try to figure out what kind of mutual role conceptions the two states impose on each other, and they negotiate what are the better ways to reconcile the difference between their mutual role conceptions. This is not what the Western relational term people would analyze. The Western relational term people would analyze how different countries come together to accept rules that should be universally applied. For the Chinese relational term literature, countries come together to try to negotiate a workable patterns for them without having to worry about their difference. So that's quite different way of thinking about relationship. But if we don't see this difference, we grab the term, we just say, oh, this relationship, oh, we have relational term in English in Sinophone world, we have relational term in Anglophone world. So let's come together, let's study relationship, let's fight against the mainstream international relational people and tell them they're doing something wrong. Then you're not gonna move anywhere, because they're talking about two different relationality. We can probably come up with several major points of difference if we compare Western relational term and Chinese relational term. One is about universality, whether or not relationality is universal. For Western relational term, relationality should be universal, has to be universal. Otherwise, it's not relationality. The state has to be constituted by massive forces in the field that affect everyone else. So everyone come from the same field. If they don't come from the same field, then they're not related. But this field, it's so massive, so you probably cannot be very specific about what has constituted them, in a similar way. So they have to come together to talk to each other, to develop rules. And by looking at the rules they develop and trace the process of negotiation and the cultural, religious, and institutional assumption that enabled development of the rules, evolution of the rules, then you understand what kind of a massive force behind them that has constituted both of them, or all of them. So you have to come from the same field. In other words, relationality must be universally applied to all those nations coming from the same field. If you cannot identify such a field that constitutes every nation state, then there's no relationality. That's for the Western relation. But for the Chinese relational term, you don't worry about all those massive forces in the field. There is no such thing in the field. And Chinese thinking has never been very ontological. This idea of field, this notion of field, is very ontological. It tells about them, or it imagines about what the nature of state has to be. But in the Chinese relational terms, people don't rely on ontological imagination. So the assumption is that everyone is different. And this being different is so nice, since we all come together despite our difference. But we have to find ways to getting us together. So the Taoist, both Taoist and Confucian thinking has this expression that the way, or Tao, the way is so broad, the real way, you cannot see any border. You cannot find borders of the real way. So the way becomes so broad, no one can be excluded on the way. All the strangers would walk alongside on the same way. That's the real, huge, big way. There's no sight in this real big way. So how you are different is not important at all. What's important is that we understand the way. We understand we're walking on the same big way, so we don't threaten each other. The way is so big, there's no need to convert one another. There's no need to change each other. There's no way to feel alienated because we're different. Because we all belong to the same way. That's the Chinese thinking. But how do we belong to the same way? That's the problem. If we cannot settle down on a proper pattern agreed upon us mutually, then we cannot be working on the same way. So in order to be working on the same way, we must have patterns, we must have roles, we must have norms for each other. And then we understand we're just a little self. There's no way we can change ourself being a little self. We want to change that, then we drop out of this way. There's no longer such a way. Everyone becomes enemies to each other. So for the Chinese relational people, they go out to find relationship. One good example is the tributary system. There's no such thing as tributary rules, like anti-proliferation or intellectual property rights, all those kind of arrangements that would require different nations to observe. There's no such thing. Every two other nations, if we talk about tributary system, every two nations should have its particular tributary arrangement. So if you look at China as the center of the world, then the tributary relationship with different vassal states have to be negotiated differently. This is very difficult to convey to Western relational people, because for the Western relational people, this means China is the center of the world, is a hierarchy, and then China would brainwash all the neighboring peripheral states into their own way of thinking. But for the Chinese relational term people, no, that's not the case. There's no any pressure for the center of the world to enforce any specific rules. It's only about ritual. It's a ritual that can camouflage our difference, or even camouflage our contradiction. As long as we have right rituals, we perform our roles according to the rituals, then we don't feel threatened to each other, because we already agree. We reciprocate our mutual existence and mutual way. So all tributary relationships being different. And I try to convince my Western colleague that Middle Kingdom does not have to be in current China. Middle Kingdom can be anywhere by definition. So the United States can be the Middle Kingdom that owns the real intellectual source of the world. So everybody should learn from United States. But everybody should learn according to everyone's own condition, rather than being converted from the center. So the Middle Kingdom, the job of Middle Kingdom is not going out to convert people. The job of the center of the Middle Kingdom, the top of the hierarchy, is to camouflage the difference. Is to, if you would say self-deceiving perhaps, telling people don't worry about things. Everything will be fine as long as you perform the rituals. That means everyone except everyone else. So the Middle Kingdom can be anywhere. As a matter of fact, historically, China had been the vassal state in history, right? Middle Kingdom can be in Liao, for example, or in Xixia, for example, or in Mongolia, for example. It doesn't have to be in China. So Middle Kingdom, or the Central Plain, so-called the metaphor of Middle Kingdom, can move, can shift. And there's no such thing as a territorial China in the ancient time. It's all under heaven. So anywhere under heaven with a kingly person emerging, that he would attract population and disciples. And then he would become the center of the world, become the son of heaven, become the Middle Kingdom. There's all kind of metaphors and stories in Chinese historical narratives about this. So it's not domination, it's not dominance. Middle Kingdom, at least ideally, philosophically, Middle Kingdom cannot dominate. If it dominates, then it's no longer Middle Kingdom. It's no longer providing or protecting the way that all the strangers can walk together alongside without threatening each other. If you dominate, then power becomes important. If power becomes important, you're jeopardizing your own rules, your own reign. Okay. So this is a different kind of relational understanding. So one big difference between Western and Chinese relation term is whether or not universality should be the principle. So for the Chinese relational term, universality is not a principle, and actually it's an antithesis. Universality, the pursuit of universality would be counterproductive, would be harmful. But for the Western international term, relationality presumes the existence of universal relationality. There are other major differences, but then I think the most important ones being the universality. And from there you can develop other, can compare the two different relational terms. You can develop other differences. I think the major philosophical setup that caused this difference is whether or not there is such an imagination of ontological field. Okay. So the message I want to get across today, and the answer I have with this difficulty in communication between Chinese and Western relational terms are twofold. On the one hand, this ontological imagination of field is essential to Western relational term, but it's not existent in the Chinese relational term. And because of that, and secondly, on the other hand, the quest for universal principles and rules that must have already constituted the nation state before their emergence is the key to analyze how nation state interact with one another. And such mode of analysis does not apply to Chinese relational term. For the Chinese relation, it's important to consciously develop relationship in order to satisfy or to meet specific conditions between two particular states. So you have all kinds of patterns emerging in for different diets, for different bilateral relationships. So these are, I think, the two major differences between Western relation term and Chinese relation term. But there's something in common. Although they come from very difficult philosophical tradition and end up with whether universal or not universal, there's one very important common features of the two relationships is that they both emphasize self-restraint. And it's interesting though that when I read Western relational terms, there seems to be the misunderstanding that self-restraint is exclusively the feature of Christian world. And there's no such thing as self-restraint outside the Christian world. And for anybody who read Confucian texts would feel puzzled because Confucius specifically telling people to restrain yourself, right? The self-restraint is a very important virtue. It's not only virtue, it's also ritual, right? Like send up enter heaven, worship heaven. That's a ritual. That's self-restraint. That meaning that emperor being selfless, so that's self-restraint. Both emphasize self-restraint, but they don't see each other emphasizing self-restraint. A lot of Chinese intellectuals would consider Western society very selfish, right? So the West consider Chinese refuse to follow the rules, breaking the rules in their private world, pretending they follow rules in the public, but they're actually breaking the rules private. So they have no self-restraint. But the Chinese people looking at the West, they don't have self-restraint. They only pursue their own interests. They don't care their parents. They don't care their children. But both emphasize self-restraint. Both consider each other without this virtue of self-restraint. I think that's very interesting. I think self-restraint for the Western relational people is that they're talking about strangers feeling responsible for each other. So we are different people. I don't know you, but when your human rights being violated, I feel extremely anxious. You know, when public security being violated, I feel very, very anxious for those people who suffered. You know, when there's a crisis, when there's, but for the Chinese population, there's no such worries for strangers. This is what the Western relational term would consider Chinese people being lacking self-restraint because they don't restrain their self in order to empathize or sympathize with other people. But for Chinese, there's Confucian very important saying that fathers should cover for sons, sons should cover for fathers. And that's outright violation of rules, right? That's outright violation of self-restraint. How can you cover for your father and leaving aside the public interest? How can you do that? But for the Confucian people, if you don't care for your father, the father don't care for son, then the relationship would be broken up. Then kinship would disappear, and then the head of society would not be respected. So if everybody cover for fathers, and every subject cover for the head of state, then you wouldn't have the kind of chaos that the Western relational term people expect to see in China, right? But when they look at the Western society, they will say, oh, fathers don't cover for son, son don't cover for father. If father commit a crime, the son can give their fathers to the police. How could that be possible? I mean, this is terrible, ethically terrible practice. So they both emphasize self-restraint. They understand self-restraint very differently. And they consider each other lacking self-restraint. So that's something that's also worth thinking. And given self-restraint is also a key word for Western relational people, I think it is important to explain what self-restraint means in the Chinese relational term in order to get them understand each other. So there are three major points I want to convey. The ontological field as an imagination of the Western relational term. Universality, rules, principles, that's essential to Western relational term. Self-restraint in order to enable strangers come together as a group, that's essential to Western relational people. And on the Chinese relational term, they understand things very differently. It's not the ontological field, rather it is a conscious effort to construct specific relationship for each other. That's the Chinese relational term. And also the self-restraint for those people who have already established a relationship with me, so it's reciprocal. Self-restraint means reciprocal. That's the Chinese relational term. I think I'll just end here and hear whether you have comments and feedbacks. We can interact a little bit. I hope I don't confuse you since you don't have the background.